It was my wedding day, the happiest day of my life. Or, at least, it was supposed to be. That was until my mother-in-law stormed into my bridal suite, pointed at my dress, and said, "This is an abomination. Cut it to match my modesty standards, or you're disrespecting the family." What she didn't expect was how I would respond, and what happened after that left her absolutely speechless. The morning of my wedding felt like the beginning of a fairy tale. The hotel suite was buzzing with excitement as my bridesmaids and I sipped mimosas, shared laughs, and admired the elegant dresses hanging in the corner. My dress, the one I had dreamed of for years, was finally within reach. A simple, flowing gown with a sweetheart neckline that fit like a glove. It was everything I wanted. My phone buzzed on the side table. A message from Mark lit up the screen. "I can't wait to see you." My heart swelled. This day was going to be perfect. The hairdresser was curling my hair as my maid of honor, Sarah, recounted a hilarious story from my bachelorette party. The room filled with laughter, and I was starting to feel the nervous energy melt away. Everything was coming together beautifully. Then there was a knock at the door. My bridesmaid Lily got up to answer, and in walked Elaine, my future mother-in-law. The cheerful chatter came to a sudden halt as her presence seemed to suck the joy out of the room. Elaine wasn't smiling. Her sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on my wedding dress. Her expression turned sour, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That's the dress?" she said, her tone filled with disbelief. I laughed, assuming she was joking. "Yes. Isn't it beautiful?" Her face twisted as if she'd tasted something bitter. "Beautiful?" she repeated, her voice rising. "It's indecent. You'll shame our family looking like that." The room went completely silent. My bridesmaids exchanged wide-eyed glances, but no one said a word. I felt my cheeks flush as I processed her words. Indecent? The dress was far from revealing. The neckline was modest, and the skirt flowed to the floor. It was elegant, tasteful, and most importantly, it felt like me. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Elaine, this dress isn't indecent. It's perfect for the ceremony. I promise you." But she cut me off, stepping closer and pointing a manicured finger at the bodice. "This neckline is far too low. And no sleeves? What kind of message are you trying to send? That's not how we dress in this family. You need to cover up, or you'll embarrass us all." Her words hit like a slap. My heart pounded as I tried to form a response, but before I could, Sarah stepped in. "With all due respect, Elaine, this is her wedding day. She should wear what makes her happy." Elaine turned to Sarah, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't about happiness. It's about respect. She's marrying into our family, and she needs to understand what's expected of her." I felt my hands balling into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Elaine," I said, trying to sound as composed as possible, "I understand this might not be what you're used to, but this dress represents me. It's my wedding day, and I chose it because it feels right." Elaine let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Your wedding day? This is about joining our family. And right now, you're showing that you don't care about our values. You're being selfish." Sarah stepped forward again, her tone more assertive this time. "She's not being selfish, Elaine. She's allowed to choose how she looks on her wedding day. This is her day, not yours." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elaine's face turned red, and for a moment, I thought she might explode. Instead, she let out a huff, turned on her heel, and stormed out of the suite. The room was quiet for several seconds after she left. I felt a mix of anger and disbelief bubbling inside me. Did that really just happen? I finally asked, breaking the silence. Sarah put a hand on my shoulder. "It did. But don't let her ruin this for you. You're the bride, and today is about you and Mark, not her." The other bridesmaids chimed in with words of encouragement, but the encounter had rattled me. Elaine's words echoed in my mind. "You're being selfish." What did she mean by that? Would she try to take this further? As much as I wanted to move on and enjoy the rest of the morning, a knot of unease settled in my stomach. Elaine wasn't someone who let things go easily, and I had a feeling this wasn't the last I'd hear about my dress. The door to the suite slammed shut behind Elaine, and for a moment, the room was silent. My bridesmaids all turned to me, their eyes filled with a mix of confusion and sympathy. I wasn't sure if I was more embarrassed by the outburst or angry at the accusation she'd just hurled at me. Disrespecting the family? How could a dress, my dress, cause so much outrage? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my thoughts, but the silence didn't last long. Less than 5 minutes later, there was another knock at the door. Lily, the ever-diplomatic bridesmaid, opened it again. Elaine re-entered, her face set in grim determination. "We're not done here," she said, arms crossed like she was ready for battle. This time, I was ready to respond. "Elaine," I began, my voice firmer than before, "this is the dress I chose. It's what I feel comfortable in. It's elegant, it's tasteful, and it's appropriate." But she wasn't having it. She pointed sharply at the neckline of the dress, her voice growing louder. "That neckline is inappropriate. Your shoulders are exposed. You look like you're going to a nightclub, not a wedding. And you think this represents our family? Absolutely not." I could feel my frustration mounting, but I managed to keep my tone measured. "With all due respect, Elaine, this dress is not inappropriate. It's a wedding gown. It's been approved by the designer, my bridal consultant, and everyone else in this room." Elaine scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Your friends don't count. They're not part of our family. And in our family, women don't show this much skin in public. It's about modesty. Tradition." The words felt like a slap. Modesty? Tradition? Mark had never mentioned anything about his family having specific standards for how women should dress, let alone at a wedding. Was this a deeply held value, or just Elaine's personal opinion? I tried to reason with her, pointing out the obvious. "Elaine, the ceremony is just a few hours away. There's no time to make any changes, even if I wanted to, which I don't." Her response was immediate and cutting. "That's your problem, not mine. If you cared about this family, you'd find a way. But clearly, you only care about yourself." Sarah stepped in again, unable to hold back this time. "Elaine, you're asking her to completely change her dress hours before the wedding. That's not fair, and it's not realistic." Elaine turned on Sarah with a glare. "Fair? Realistic? It's not about fairness. It's about doing what's right. This isn't about her. It's about the family she's joining. She's marrying my son, and that means she represents us now." The tension in the room was unbearable. I could feel tears threatening to well up, but I refused to cry in front of her. Instead, I squared my shoulders and looked her in the eye. "Elaine, I respect your opinions, but this is my wedding day. I'm not changing the dress. If that's something you can't accept, I'm sorry, but the decision is final." Her face turned an alarming shade of red, and for a moment, I thought she might explode. But instead, she took a step closer to me, lowering her voice but somehow making it even more intimidating. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. "You think this is about a dress? It's about respect. And you're showing everyone here that you have none." I felt a flash of anger surge through me. "I'm not showing disrespect, Elaine. I'm setting boundaries. And this boundary is non-negotiable." She stared at me, her expression shifting from anger to something more calculating. Finally, she said, "Fine. Have it your way. But don't say I didn't warn you when people start talking about how inappropriate you looked on your wedding day." With that, she spun on her heel and left the room again, leaving a trail of tension so thick it felt suffocating. The moment the door closed, Sarah let out a low whistle.
"Wow.
"She's intense," she said, breaking the silence. "That's putting it mildly," Lily added, shaking her head. "Are you okay?" I nodded, but my hands were trembling. "I'll be fine. I didn't expect this. None of us did. I always knew Elaine was opinionated, but this level of control and anger was new. It felt personal, like she wasn't just upset about the dress, but about me as a person." As the minutes ticked by and the hairdresser continued working on my hair, I kept replaying the confrontation in my head. Why was she so fixated on the dress? Was it really about modesty, or was there something deeper at play? When the hairdresser finished, I slipped into my dress, my bridesmaids helping with the buttons and the veil. As I stood in front of the full-length mirror, I tried to focus on how I felt in the dress, how beautiful, confident, and happy it made me. But Elaine's words lingered in my mind like a dark cloud. This wasn't over. I could feel it. Just as I was about to push those thoughts aside and focus on the day ahead, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Mark. "Hey, everything okay? Mom just called me. She's upset about something." I stared at the message, my stomach sinking. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Elaine's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. "You're going to regret this." "I'll make sure of it," she had said, her voice dripping with venom. The door slammed behind her, and I stood there, trying to collect myself while my bridesmaids whispered in hushed tones. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "I don't like this, not one bit. She's up to something." Did you see the look on her face? I nodded, my stomach twisting in knots. Elaine wasn't the type to make empty threats. Over the years, I'd seen glimpses of her controlling tendencies, but nothing like this. This felt personal. Do you think she'd actually try to ruin the ceremony? Lily asked, her voice laced with concern. I don't know, I admitted, pressing my fingers to my temples. But I can't let her dictate this. It's my wedding day. I just have to focus on Mark and getting through this without letting her derail it. The suite buzzed back to life as my bridesmaids worked to distract me. Sarah pulled out the emergency bridal kit and insisted on touching up my makeup, saying it was the perfect way to wipe Elaine's negativity off my face. Lily poured another round of mimosas, while Megan, the quietest of the group, took charge of coordinating with the wedding planner. Despite their best efforts, my mind kept replaying the encounter. Elaine's words, her tone, the way she looked at me as if I were some kind of outsider threatening her family's legacy, it all stuck with me. Mark's text still sat unanswered on my phone. I stared at it, debating whether to tell him everything or shield him from the drama. After all, he deserved to have a perfect day, too. But then again, this wasn't something I could handle alone. I finally typed out a response. She's upset about the dress. She wanted me to change it. We had words, but it's fine now. Don't worry about it, I'll see you soon. It wasn't the full truth, but it felt like the right thing to say in the moment. By the time I was fully dressed and ready, the suite had settled back into a happy, nervous buzz. My bridesmaids gushed over how stunning I looked, snapping photos and fluffing my veil. For a moment, I felt like the bride I was supposed to be, excited, radiant, and surrounded by love. But that moment didn't last long. As we were gathering our things to head downstairs, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was one of the wedding coordinators. She looked flustered, clutching her clipboard tightly. Hi, she said, her voice hesitant. I don't want to alarm you, but Elaine has been, making some requests. Requests? I asked, my heart sinking. She's been asking about changing the seating arrangements, the coordinator explained. She's also been very vocal about the music playlist for the ceremony, saying some of the selections aren't appropriate. And she mentioned something about talking to the officiant. My bridesmaids all gasped in unison, but I felt a surge of anger rising in me. This was too much. First, she tried to control what I wore, and now she was trying to change the actual ceremony? I clenched my jaw. Thank you for letting me know, I told the coordinator. But none of those changes are happening. The seating stays as it is, the music stays as it is, and the officiant does not need to hear from her. The coordinator nodded quickly. Understood. I just thought you should know. We'll handle it. As soon as she left, Sarah turned to me, her hands on her hips. That's it. I'm officially on Elaine watch. If she so much as looks at the flower arrangements the wrong way, I'll take her out myself. Lily nodded. We've got your back. She's not going to ruin this for you. Their support bolstered me, but the knot in my stomach tightened. I had no doubt Elaine would find another way to insert herself into the day. She wasn't the type to back down easily. As we made our way to the ceremony site, I took a deep breath, trying to push the tension aside. This was my moment. I wasn't going to let her rob me of it. The ceremony space was breathtaking, just as I'd imagined it would be. The aisle was lined with fresh flowers. The sunlight streaming through the windows cast a golden glow over everything, and Mark was waiting for me at the altar, looking more handsome than I'd ever seen him. For a moment, all my worries melted away. This was what mattered. Marrying the man I loved, surrounded by the people who cared about us. But as I made my way down the aisle, I couldn't help but notice Elaine in the front row. Her arms were crossed, her lips pursed, and she was glaring at me like I'd personally betrayed her. Mark's warm smile brought me back to the present, and as I reached him, he whispered, "You look amazing." I smiled back, my heart swelling with love. But even as the ceremony began, I couldn't shake the feeling that Elaine was planning something. The vows went off without a hitch, and I felt myself relax a little as Mark slid the ring onto my finger. For a brief, blissful moment, everything felt perfect. But as we turned to face the audience, ready to make our grand exit as husband and wife, Elaine stood up. "This is a disgrace," she announced, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "How could you marry someone who doesn't respect our family's traditions?" The room fell into stunned silence. My breath caught in my throat as all eyes turned to her. Mark's grip on my hand tightened, and he stepped forward, his voice firm. "Mom, that's enough." But Elaine wasn't done. She pointed at me, her voice trembling with anger. She doesn't belong in this family. She's already proven that. The tension in the room was suffocating. I could feel tears welling up, but I refused to let them fall. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and here she was, trying to destroy it. But what Elaine didn't realize was that she had just crossed a line she couldn't come back from, and Mark and I were ready to stand together. The ceremony began like something out of a dream. The soft music floated through the air, and the scent of fresh flowers surrounded us. As I stood in the back, waiting for my cue to walk down the aisle, I felt a strange combination of joy and unease. This was the moment I had been waiting for, yet Elaine's lingering presence in the back of my mind was hard to shake. When the doors opened and I stepped into view, I locked eyes with Mark. He looked at me as though I was the most beautiful woman in the world, and in that moment, my worries faded. This was what mattered. This was why we were here. As I took each step down the aisle, I couldn't help but notice Elaine in the front row. She sat stiffly, her arms crossed and her lips pressed into a thin line. While everyone else smiled and admired the procession, her glare felt like a weight on my chest. I could almost hear her unspoken judgment. "You're not good enough." But I kept walking, kept smiling, kept focusing on Mark. The officiant's voice carried through the space as he guided us through the ceremony. Mark and I exchanged nervous smiles and soft laughs at the little moments only we could understand. My heart swelled as I recited my vows, each word filled with the love and commitment I felt for him. Mark's vows were just as beautiful. His voice was steady, his words sincere, and I could see the tears glistening in his eyes as he spoke. When he slid the ring onto my finger, it felt like the entire world faded away, leaving only the two of us. As the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, I stole a glance at Elaine. She was sitting rigidly, her expression unreadable. For the first time all day, she wasn't glaring or frowning. She was simply staring. I thought, maybe she's finally accepted it. Maybe she's going to let it go. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as Mark and I turned to face the audience. The applause, the cheers, the happiness. It was everything I dreamed of. But as we started to walk back down the aisle together, hand in hand, the moment was shattered. Elaine suddenly stood up from her seat, her voice ringing out loud and clear. "This is a disgrace." The room fell silent. The laughter and applause died instantly as every head turned to her. My heart stopped, and I felt Mark's hand tighten around mine. "How could you marry someone who doesn't respect our family's traditions?" she continued, her voice trembling with anger. I froze, unsure of how to react. Elaine's words were sharp, cutting through the joy of the moment like a knife. I could see the confused and concerned expressions of our guests as they looked between her and us. Mark stepped forward, pulling me slightly behind him as he faced his mother. His voice was calm but firm. "Mom, this is not the time or place." Elaine ignored him, her focus entirely on me. "Do you think this is how a wife should present herself? Do you think this is how a member of our family should behave? You've embarrassed me, and you've embarrassed this family." The officiant cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion later." "No," Elaine snapped, cutting him off. "This needs to be said now. She needs to understand what she's done." I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, my heart pounding in my chest. I opened my mouth to speak, but Mark beat me to it. "You're out of line," he said, his voice louder this time. "This is our wedding day, not your stage. If you can't support us, you're welcome to leave." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Elaine stared at him, her face a mix of shock and betrayal. "You're choosing her over your family?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I'm choosing my wife," Mark said firmly. "And if you can't accept that, then you're the one disrespecting this family." For a moment, no one moved. Elaine seemed to be grappling with what had just happened, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form a response. Finally, she let out a frustrated huff and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking against the floor as she left. As the doors slammed shut behind her, the room remained eerily quiet. I looked around, unsure of how to proceed. Then, Mark took my hand and smiled at me. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. I nodded, and together, we walked down the aisle, the sound of hesitant applause growing louder as we made our way out. In the reception area, the tension finally began to dissipate. Guests started to mingle again, the soft hum of conversation filling the space. Mark and I took a moment to ourselves, standing off to the side as we processed what had just happened. I'm so sorry, he said, his eyes filled with guilt. I didn't think she would go that far. It's not your fault, I said, squeezing his hand. You stood up for me, and that's all that matters. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to my forehead. I love you. And no matter what happens, we'll handle it together. I smiled, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. Elaine might have tried to sabotage the ceremony, but she hadn't succeeded. Mark and I were stronger than her attempts to undermine us, and nothing was going to change that. But as the night wore on, I couldn't help but wonder what Elaine's next move would be. Something told me this wasn't the last we'd hear from her. The reception hall was a picture of perfection. The soft glow of string lights reflected off the polished floors, and the hum of cheerful conversations filled the air. Mark and I entered to a wave of applause, his hand firmly gripping mine as we made our way to the center of the room for our first dance. For a brief moment, everything felt exactly as it should. The stress of the ceremony, the tension with Elaine, it all melted away as Mark held me close. The music played, and we swayed together, surrounded by the love and support of our friends and family. I allowed myself to breathe, to focus on him and the promise we'd just made to each other. But even in the happiest moments, I couldn't ignore the weight of Elaine's presence. I could feel her eyes on us, sharp and unyielding, as we moved across the dance floor. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of her seated at the corner table, her arms crossed and her expression icy. She hadn't spoken to us since her dramatic exit during the ceremony, but the tension radiating from her corner of the room was impossible to ignore. As the evening went on, I did my best to steer clear of her. Mark and I mingled with guests, posed for photos, and enjoyed the energy of the reception. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the excitement of finally being married, it was all so beautiful. When it was time for the cake cutting, I felt the weight of her gaze again. Elaine remained seated, not even pretending to be part of the moment. I forced myself to focus on Mark, laughing as he playfully smeared a bit of frosting on my nose before kissing it off. The guests cheered, and for a while, it felt like Elaine's shadow couldn't reach us. But that peace didn't last. As dinner was served, I saw her rise from her table, her expression determined. She walked straight toward us, cutting through the crowd like a ship slicing through waves. I braced myself, trying to appear calm as she approached. I want to talk to you, Elaine said, her voice low but firm. She wasn't asking, it was a demand. I hesitated, glancing at Mark, who looked ready to intervene. But I shook my head. It's okay, I whispered. I'll handle it. Mark didn't look convinced, but he nodded, his hand resting lightly on my arm as I rose from my seat. Elaine was already heading toward the side of the room, expecting me to follow. We stepped into a quieter corner near the edge of the reception hall. The muffled sound of laughter and music drifted in the background as Elaine turned to face me. Her expression was tight, her jaw clenched so hard I thought it might snap. You embarrassed me, she began, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and something that almost sounded like hurt. In front of my friends, in front of our family. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was for me? I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of patience I had left. Elaine, I understand you're upset. But this was my wedding. Mark's and mine. Not yours. I'm sorry if you feel hurt, but I'm not sorry for standing up for myself. Her eyes narrowed. You call this standing up for yourself? Disrespecting me, ignoring our family's traditions, and making a spectacle during the ceremony? That's what you think is appropriate. I felt my anger rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. Elaine, I didn't ignore anything. I chose a dress that made me feel beautiful. I didn't ask you to agree with it, but I also didn't expect you to try to control it, or make a scene during one of the most important moments of my life. Her voice rose, the calm veneer cracking. You're selfish. You think this is all about you, but it's not. When you married Mark, you married into this family, and you need to understand what that means. I met her gaze, refusing to back down. I do understand what it means. It means I married the man I love, and I'm building a life with him. But it doesn't mean I have to lose who I am, or let someone else dictate how I live my life. Mark loves me for who I am, and I won't apologize for being myself. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face a mixture of disbelief and fury. You've got a lot of nerve, she finally said, her voice dripping with disdain. Mark deserves better than this. Better than you. Those words hit harder than I expected, but I refused to let her see it. Instead, I stood my ground, my voice steady. I think you're wrong, Elaine. Mark and I love each other, and that's what matters. You don't have to like me, but you do have to respect my place in his life. Because I'm not going anywhere. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might say something else. But instead, she turned abruptly and stormed away, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing as I processed what had just happened. Part of me felt drained, but another part felt stronger than ever. Elaine could throw her tantrums, make her accusations, and try to undermine me all she wanted, but she couldn't shake the foundation Mark and I had built together. When I returned to the table, Mark was waiting, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "What happened?" he asked quietly, taking my hand in his. I gave him a small smile, squeezing his hand reassuringly. "Nothing I couldn't handle. She's upset, but she'll get over it. Eventually." Mark frowned, but he didn't press further. Instead, he leaned in and kissed my forehead. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. "You're amazing." The rest of the night went on without further interruptions. Elaine stayed at her table, her icy demeanor unchanged, but she didn't approach us again. I focused on enjoying the reception, dancing with Mark, laughing with friends, and soaking in every moment of the day I'd worked so hard to plan. But even as I smiled and laughed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Elaine's anger wasn't just going to disappear overnight, and I knew there were still battles ahead. But for now, I let myself enjoy the victory of standing my ground, and the love of the man who made it all worthwhile. As I returned to our table, the noise of the reception seemed to fade into the background. My heart was still racing from my confrontation with Elaine, and I couldn't hide the tension on my face. Mark immediately noticed. His eyes searched mine, his expression shifting from excitement to concern. "What happened?" he asked, leaning closer. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. "What did she say to you?" I hesitated, glancing around at the nearby tables. The last thing I wanted was for this to escalate further, but Mark deserved to know the truth. "She pulled me aside to say I embarrassed her," I began, keeping my voice low. "She thinks I've disrespected the family. She even said you deserve better than me." His jaw tightened, and I could see the anger building in his eyes. Mark wasn't the type to lose his temper, but I knew this was pushing him to his limit. "She really said that?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "She's upset about the dress, the ceremony, everything. I told her I wouldn't apologize for being myself, but she wouldn't let it go." For a moment, Mark just sat there, staring at the table as if he was trying to process what I'd told him. Then, without another word, he stood up. "Mark," I whispered, grabbing his hand. "What are you doing?" He looked down at me, his expression resolute. "I'm putting an end to this." Before I could stop him, he walked away, weaving through the tables until he reached Elaine. She was seated with a few of Mark's aunts and uncles, all of whom stopped mid-conversation as he approached. "Mom," Mark said, his voice loud enough to draw attention from the surrounding tables. "We need to talk." Elaine looked up at him, her expression a mix of annoyance and confusion. "Mark, this isn't the time for—" "No," he interrupted, his tone firm. "This stops now." The room began to quiet as people noticed the tension. Conversations died down, and heads turned toward their table. I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. This was not how I wanted the reception to go, but I also knew Mark wasn't going to let this slide. "You've been making this day about you," Mark continued, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "And it's not. It's about me and my name. It's about us starting our life together. If you can't support that, then maybe you shouldn't be here." The entire room fell silent. Elaine's face turned red, her lips parting as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Mark, I'm your mother," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm only trying to do what's best for you." "What's best for me?" Mark repeated, his tone incredulous. "Mom, what's best for me is being with the woman I love. The woman I chose to marry. And right now, you're disrespecting her, and you're disrespecting me." Elaine opened her mouth to respond, but Mark held up a hand to stop her.
"No, Mom.
"You don't get to control this. You don't get to ruin our wedding. If you can't be happy for us, then maybe it's better if you leave." The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel every eye on them, every guest holding their breath as they waited to see what Elaine would do. For a moment, she just stared at Mark, her face a mixture of shock and indignation. Then, slowly, she rose from her seat. "Fine," she said, her voice cold and sharp. If that's how you feel, I'll go. But don't come crying to me when you realize what a mistake you've made. Mark didn't flinch. I won't. And I hope, for your sake, that you realize how wrong you've been before it's too late. With that, Elaine turned and walked out of the reception hall, her heels clicking against the floor as the doors closed behind her. The room was still quiet as Mark returned to our table. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares, the murmurs starting to ripple through the crowd. Mark didn't seem to care. He sat down beside me, took my hand in his, and said softly, "I'm sorry." I blinked, taken aback. "Why are you apologizing?" "For not standing up to her sooner," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I should have stopped this before it ever got to this point. She had no right to say those things to you." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them away. "You don't have to apologize, Mark. You stood up for me when it mattered. That's what counts." He squeezed my hand, his expression softening. "I love you," he said, his voice steady. "And I promise you, no one, not even my mother, is going to come between us." "I love you, too," I whispered, feeling the knot in my stomach begin to unravel. As the reception slowly came back to life, guests started clapping and cheering for us. I could feel the energy shift, the tension dissipating as people returned to the dance floor and the celebration resumed. Sarah appeared at my side, a mischievous grin on her face. "Well, that was dramatic," she said, handing me a glass of champagne. "But I've got to say, watching Mark tell her off, that was legendary." Lily chimed in, laughing. "Seriously, I don't think anyone here is going to forget this wedding anytime soon." I couldn't help but laugh, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. It wasn't the perfect day I'd imagined, but it was ours. And no matter what Elaine tried, she couldn't take that away from us. As the night wore on, I danced with Mark, laughed with friends, and soaked in the love and support of the people who truly mattered. Elaine might have left, but the joy of the evening remained. And as I looked at Mark, his smile brighter than ever, I knew one thing for certain. We were stronger together, and nothing, not even Elaine's disapproval, could change that. When Elaine stormed out of the reception hall, I thought the drama had finally reached its climax. The air was still heavy with tension, but as the guests slowly returned to their meals and conversations, I began to believe we could salvage the rest of the night. But Elaine wasn't the only voice in the room with something to say. As I sat with Mark, his hand resting protectively on mine, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor drew everyone's attention. Mark's Aunt Linda, Elaine's older sister, stood up from her seat near the head table. She cleared her throat, her expression one of steely determination. "Mark's right," she said, her voice carrying across the room with surprising authority. "This isn't Elaine's day. It's not about her, and it never was. It's about Mark and my name, and they deserve to have their moment." The room buzzed with murmurs, guests exchanging surprised glances. Linda wasn't known for being confrontational, but there was something about her tone that commanded attention. Elaine had barely made it halfway to the door when she froze, slowly turning back toward her sister. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and incredulous. Linda didn't flinch. "You heard me, Elaine. This isn't your day, and it's not your place to ruin it. You've been making everything about yourself, just like you always do." The murmurs grew louder, and I could see the stunned expressions on the faces of Mark's relatives. It was clear that this wasn't the first time Elaine had caused a scene, but hearing Linda call her out so publicly was something no one had expected. Elaine's face turned a deep shade of red, and for a moment, it looked like she might fire back. But Linda wasn't finished. "You did the same thing at my wedding," Linda said, her voice steady and firm. "Remember that? You showed up late, complained about the flowers, and told everyone my dress wasn't appropriate. I let it slide back then because I didn't want to make a scene, but I'm not going to stand by and watch you do the same thing to Mark and my name. It's time to stop." The room fell silent again, all eyes on Elaine. Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for something to say, but no words came out. "Linda, you don't understand," Elaine started, her voice faltering. "No, Elaine," Linda interrupted, her tone sharp. "I understand perfectly. You can't stand not being the center of attention. But this isn't about you. It's about your son and his wife. If you can't support them, then maybe it's better that you leave." The finality of Linda's words hung in the air, and I could see Elaine's composure beginning to crack. She glanced around the room, as if looking for someone to defend her, but no one did. Even Mark's father, who had remained silent throughout the evening, avoided her gaze. Finally, Elaine muttered something under her breath, her voice too low to hear, and turned to leave. This time she didn't stop. The doors closed behind her with a dull thud, and for the first time all day, I felt like I could finally breathe. Linda returned to her seat, and the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate. Guests whispered to one another, some looking shocked, others nodding in agreement. Mark turned to his aunt, a look of gratitude on his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Linda smiled, reaching out to pat his hand. "I've known Elaine a long time," she said. "And I love her, but someone needed to tell her the truth. I just wish I'd done it sooner." I felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over me. Linda's support meant more than she could know. For so long, I had felt like I was fighting this battle against Elaine alone, but now I realized I wasn't. The reception regained its rhythm, the music starting up again as guests returned to the dance floor. The weight that had been pressing down on me all day seemed to lift, and for the first time, I allowed myself to truly enjoy the celebration. As Mark and I danced together, I couldn't help but smile. The day hadn't gone exactly as planned, but in a strange way, it felt even more meaningful. We had faced challenges together, stood up for ourselves, and emerged stronger for it. Later that evening, as the reception was winding down, Linda pulled me aside. "I'm sorry you had to deal with all of this on your wedding day," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "But I want you to know something. Mark is lucky to have you, and so is this family. Don't let Elaine make you think otherwise." Her words brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That means so much to me." She smiled warmly. "Welcome to the family, sweetheart." As Mark and I said our goodbyes to the last of our guests and prepared to leave for the night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected. The day had been far from perfect, but it had shown me just how strong our love was, and how much support we had from the people who truly mattered. Elaine might not have given her blessing, but I didn't need it. I had Mark, I had Linda, and I had the unwavering belief that we could face whatever challenges lay ahead together. And as we drove away into the night, my hand in Mark's, I knew this was just the beginning of a beautiful journey. When the doors closed behind Elaine for the second time that evening, the shift in the room was palpable. It was as if a weight had been lifted, the tension dissipating like a storm finally passing. People who had been whispering at their tables began to laugh and chat more freely. The DJ, sensing the change, queued up an upbeat song, and the dance floor filled almost instantly. I stood off to the side for a moment, watching the scene unfold. After everything that had happened, it was surreal to see the reception come alive again. It felt like the evening was reclaiming itself, no longer dominated by Elaine's dramatic exit or her simmering disapproval. Mark walked over to me, his tie slightly loosened, and wrapped his arms around my waist. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly, his forehead resting against mine. I let out a long breath. I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Better," I said honestly. "I think we can finally enjoy the rest of the night." His lips curved into a gentle smile. "Good. Because I owe you a dance." The DJ called us to the dance floor for our first dance as husband and wife. The lights dimmed slightly, and the soft notes of our song began to play. Mark took my hand, leading me to the center of the floor as our guests gathered around. For the first time all day, I felt completely at ease. Mark's hand rested gently on my back, guiding me in time with the music. His eyes never left mine, and in that moment, it was as if we were the only two people in the room. "You're amazing," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the music. "So are you," I whispered back, a smile tugging at my lips. "Even after all of this," he chuckled softly. "Especially after all of this. If we can handle today, we can handle anything." The applause and cheers that erupted as the song ended felt like the final seal of approval. We were officially married, officially starting our lives together, and nothing, not even Elaine, could take that away. As the night went on, the atmosphere grew even livelier. The dance floor was packed, the bar was busy, and laughter filled the room. Guests came up to congratulate us, offering kind words and well wishes that felt even more meaningful after the day's events. Sarah found me near the dessert table, a glass of champagne in her hand. "You handled that like a queen," she said, her eyes sparkling with admiration. "Seriously, I don't know how you stayed so calm." I smiled, though the truth was more complicated. "I think I was too shocked to do anything else," I admitted. "But honestly, I just kept reminding myself that it's about Mark and me. No one else." Sarah nodded, raising her glass in a mock toast. "Well, here's to you. The most graceful bride in the history of weddings." I laughed. clinking my glass against hers. I don't know about graceful, but I'll take it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of dancing, laughter, and heartfelt moments. Mark's cousin led a conga line through the reception hall, much to everyone's delight. The flower girl, no longer shy, twirled on the dance floor like she was the star of the show. Even Mark's dad, who had been noticeably quiet during the earlier drama, pulled me aside to say, "Welcome to the family. And thank you for putting up with all of us." His words meant more than he probably realized. At one point, I found myself sitting with Linda, who had become an unexpected ally that evening. She was nursing a glass of red wine, her heels kicked off under the table. "You did good, kid," she said, giving me an approving nod. "You didn't let her push you around. That's important." "I don't think I could have done it without you," I replied sincerely. "You saying something, it meant so much to me. To both of us." Linda waved a hand dismissively. "Elaine's my sister and I love her, but she's been like this for years. Someone had to call her out, and it's about time it happened in front of the whole family. Maybe now she'll think twice before pulling something like this again." I wasn't so sure, but I appreciated Linda's optimism. As the night began to wind down, Mark and I snuck away for a moment of quiet. We found a spot on the venue's terrace, the cool night air refreshing after hours on the dance floor. Mark wrapped his arm around me, pulling me close as we looked out at the stars. "I know today wasn't exactly what you planned," he said, his voice gentle. "But I hope you still had a good time." I turned to him, smiling. "I did. Because I married you. And that's all that matters." He leaned down to kiss me, the kind of kiss that made everything else fade away. "I love you," he said softly. "I love you, too," I replied, resting my head on his shoulder. In that moment, I realized something. I had married into this family, flaws and all. Elaine might be a challenge, but I also had Mark. And he was worth every bit of drama. The challenges we faced that day didn't feel like a sign of trouble. They felt like proof of our strength. If we could navigate this, we could handle anything. As we stood there, the sounds of the reception fading behind us, I knew one thing for sure. The rest of our lives would be an adventure. And I was ready for every moment of it. The morning after the wedding was surreal. Mark and I woke up in the honeymoon suite, surrounded by remnants of the celebration, champagne flutes on the nightstand, my veil draped over a chair, and a stack of congratulatory cards on the desk. The events of the previous day felt like a whirlwind, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to relive them. Mark stirred beside me, his arm pulling me closer. "Good morning, Mrs. Last Name," he murmured, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Good morning, Mr. Last Name," I replied with a soft smile. For a moment, everything felt perfect. The weight of Elaine's drama, the tension of the day, it all seemed far away. But as we lay there, the memories began creeping back. Mark must have felt it too because he sighed and said, "We should probably talk about what happened yesterday." We sat on the edge of the bed, still wrapped in the fluffy robes the hotel provided. Mark looked down at his hands, his expression pensive. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," he began, his voice sincere. "I should have stepped in sooner. I should have stopped her before it got to the point where she confronted you, let alone tried to hijack the ceremony." I shook my head, placing my hand over his. "Mark, you don't have to apologize for her actions. You stood up for me when it mattered most, and that's all I could ever ask for." "I know," he said, his brow furrowed. "But it still doesn't sit right with me. She crossed so many lines yesterday, and I let it go on for too long. That's on me." There was a pause as he gathered his thoughts. "I love her. She's my mom, and I know she's always going to be part of our lives. But I love you more. And I promise you, from now on, I'm setting firmer boundaries with her. She won't get away with something like that again." His words brought tears to my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It means so much to me that you're willing to do that." Mark leaned in, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "You're my wife now," he said. "My partner. You come first, always." As we sat there, holding each other, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I reached for it, already guessing who it might be. Sure enough, it was a text from Elaine. The message was long, the kind that required scrolling to read in full. It started with a perfunctory "congratulations," but quickly devolved into a passive-aggressive critique of everything from the wedding dress to the seating arrangements. She claimed she was only offering feedback to help us avoid future mistakes, but the underlying tone was clear. She was still upset, and she wanted me to know it. I handed the phone to Mark without a word. He read the message, his expression darkening with every sentence. When he finished, he set the phone down and said, "We're not engaging with this." "Agreed," I said. "I'm not going to let her ruin our honeymoon." 2. Mark sent a short, polite reply, thanking her for her input, but making it clear that we wouldn't be discussing it further. Then he turned his phone off and suggested I do the same. For the rest of the day, we focused on each other. We ordered room service, laughed about the less-than-perfect moments of the wedding, and flipped through photos our friends had sent us. Every now and then, one of us would make a joke about Elaine's dramatic exit, and while it still stung a little, we found ways to lighten the mood. "I'll admit," Mark said as he poured us each a glass of champagne, "I didn't think Aunt Linda had it in her to stand up to my mom like that." That might have been the most shocking part of the day. I laughed, clinking my glass against his. "I'm just glad someone else had our back. Linda's my new favorite person. She's always been the no-nonsense one in the family," Mark said. "I think Mom's been pushing her buttons for years." Yesterday was just the breaking point. As the evening wore on, we began planning for the days ahead. Our honeymoon was set to start the next morning, a week-long getaway to a tropical island where we could finally relax and enjoy being newlyweds. "We'll start fresh when we get back," Mark said, his tone resolute. "But on our terms. If Mom wants to be part of our lives, she'll have to respect the boundaries we set." I nodded, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. "I think that's the best approach. She might not like it, but it's what we need to do." Before bed, I sent a quick text to Sarah, thanking her for being such a supportive maid of honor. Her reply came almost instantly. "You were amazing yesterday. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Love you." As I set my phone down, I realized just how much love and support we had in our corner. Elaine might have tried to overshadow our day, but she didn't succeed. That night, as Mark and I fell asleep in each other's arms, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in weeks. The road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, but I knew we'd face them together. Elaine might still be a looming presence in our lives, but she wasn't the one steering the ship. Mark and I were building a life together, and for the first time, I felt confident that nothing, and no one, could tear us apart. Looking back on our wedding day, I sometimes laugh at the sheer absurdity of it all. It wasn't the fairy tale celebration I had dreamed about as a little girl, but in its own chaotic way, it turned out to be a day I'll never forget. More importantly, it taught me lessons I hadn't expected to learn so early in our marriage, lessons about boundaries, resilience, and the unwavering strength of love. The days following the wedding were a mixture of reflection and recovery. Mark and I spent our honeymoon soaking up the sun on a white sand beach, sipping fruity cocktails, and, for the first time in weeks, truly relaxing. It was the perfect escape, a world away from the drama we had left behind. But even as we lounged under the palm trees, Elaine's shadow wasn't far from our thoughts. Occasionally, Mark would bring up something she'd said or done, and we'd dissect it together, trying to make sense of her actions. "She's always been like this, you know," Mark said one afternoon as we walked along the shore. "My mom has this need to control everything. I think it comes from a place of fear, but that doesn't excuse how she treats people." I nodded, the waves lapping at our feet. "I don't hate her, Mark. I just need her to understand that I'm not going to let her control my life. Or ours. And she will," Mark said firmly. "Because I won't let her either." That conversation became the foundation of a new approach to dealing with Elaine. When we returned home, we knew we had to confront her behavior head-on, but we wanted to do it from a place of calm and unity. We agreed that we wouldn't tolerate any more attempts to undermine our relationship or dictate how we lived our lives. The first test came not long after we got back. Elaine invited us over for dinner, her tone suspiciously cheerful in the text she sent. "It's a peace offering," Mark said, rolling his eyes as he read the message aloud. We arrived at her house armed with a plan: stay polite but firm, and if she crossed a line, we would address it immediately. Dinner started out innocently enough, though the tension was palpable. Elaine made small talk, asking about our honeymoon and commenting on how well-rested we looked. But as the evening wore on, her true colors began to show. "So, have you thought about starting a family yet?" she asked, her fork pausing midair. I braced myself, already sensing where this was going. "Not yet," I said, keeping my tone light. "We're still settling into married life." "Well," she said, a faint edge creeping into her voice, "just make sure you're ready when the time comes. It's important to raise children with the right values, you know." Mark didn't miss a beat. "Mom," he said, his voice steady, "we'll raise our kids however we see fit." That's not up for discussion. Elaine's eyes widened, clearly taken aback by his directness. I was just giving advice, she said, her tone defensive. And we appreciate it, Mark replied. But we need you to respect our boundaries. That includes not making assumptions or comments about how we'll live our lives. The room went quiet, and for a moment, I thought Elaine might argue. But instead, she nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. I see, she said finally. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was progress. Over time, things began to improve, albeit slowly. Elaine didn't suddenly transform into the picture-perfect mother-in-law, but she started to make an effort to respect our boundaries. There were still moments of friction, of course, but each one became an opportunity to reinforce the expectations we had set. Through it all, Mark remained my unwavering partner. Every time Elaine pushed, he stood by me, his support a constant reminder that I wasn't in this alone. Do you think she'll ever fully accept me? I asked him one evening, as we cuddled on the couch. She already does, he said without hesitation. She just doesn't know how to show it yet. But even if she didn't, it wouldn't matter. You're my family now, and that's all I care about. Reflecting on that chaotic day, I realize now that it wasn't just about standing up to Elaine, it was about standing up for myself and for the life Mark and I are building together. It taught me the importance of setting boundaries early and sticking to them, even when it's uncomfortable or difficult. Elaine and I are still a work in progress. There are moments when she slips back into her old habits, and I have to gently remind her where the line is. But I've learned that boundaries are an act of love, for myself, for Mark, and even for Elaine. They allow us to have a relationship that's healthier and more respectful than it ever could have been without them. Most of all, I've learned that perfection is overrated. Our wedding day wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was ours. It was a day full of love, laughter, and yes, a little bit of drama. And in the end, that's what makes it so memorable. Looking ahead, I know there will be challenges. Marriage isn't always easy, and neither is navigating relationships with extended family. But as long as Mark and I have each other, I know we'll get through anything. So, to anyone out there dealing with a difficult in-law, take it from me. Set your boundaries, stick to them, and don't lose sight of what matters. You might not change them overnight, or at all, but you'll learn to protect your peace. And that's worth everything.